The morning the story began, the light came late over the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains, spilling gold across a land that had long forgotten the softness of mercy. The wind dragged red dust in slow, swirling ribbons across the main street of Dust Devil Pass, a town that smelled of sweat, sulphur, and old whiskey, where men gambled away more than just their money, and the silence between gunshots was often the only peace a man could find. I rode in as the sun climbed higher, its heat already clinging to the back of my neck, making the leather of my saddle crack and sigh. My horse snorted, uneasy, as if he too could sense the hunger that hung in the air. My name was Silas Vance, though in most territories they called me Stone Eye. I was a man who had learned that the world takes more than it gives, and that sometimes survival is the only kind of honor a man can afford. The war had stripped me bare years ago, left me with scars no whiskey could soften, and memories I couldn't bury deep enough. I'd come here chasing a bounty, a bank robber with a lazy eye and a bad habit of living longer than good men. There was $500 on his head, and I needed every cent. Not for luxury, not for dreams, but for the quiet dignity of a man who still wanted to eat without owing anyone a thing. Dust Devil Pass looked like every other town the desert spat up, built on lies, greed, and the kind of despair that settles like rust on the bones. Wooden fronts leaned against each other for strength, and the sound of hammers on tin mixed with the far-off laughter of men pretending to forget who they were. I tied my horse, adjusted the brim of my hat, and stepped into the heat, shimmering off the ground like a curse. Then I heard it, the kind of laughter that doesn't belong to joy. It was sharp, cutting, the sound of men trying to hide their smallness by mocking someone weaker. I followed the noise to the center square. A flatbed wagon stood there, its boards rough and splintered, the color of old blood baked into the grain. 3 figures were chained to its rail, 2 men with heads bowed, and 1 woman standing still as carved stone. Around them, miners and drifters shouted, their words sour and thick, their eyes lit with something cruel. She caught my gaze like a flash of light in a storm. Her hair was long, black as a raven's wing, tangled with dust, but still beautiful in a way that no man there seemed capable of seeing. Her dress was torn, a ghost of modesty clinging to her shoulders, and though her arms were bound, her spine stayed straight. She refused to flinch no matter what filth they threw at her. That defiance cut through the heat like cold water. I didn't know her name then, but later I'd learn it was Tayuna. They called her Kestrel, the kind of nickname men give to something they want to cage and never understand. The auctioneer barked prices like he was selling livestock, and the men jeered louder with every call. She had been a wife once, they said, to a herder who tried to fight for his land. He was gone now, buried somewhere under the same dust that stained her feet. What was left of her pride stood on that wagon, trembling but unbroken. I told myself to walk away. I had no reason to get involved. Justice didn't feed a man. It only left him hungry in better company. Yet something inside me, the old unwanted pulse of conscience, refused to stay quiet. I could feel the weight of her silence pressing against my chest. The war had taught me to ignore the screams of others, but not the silence that followed. That silence meant surrender, and I couldn't bear to see it take her too. Before I even knew I'd decided, my boots were already moving across the dust. I reached into my coat, pulled out the last of my money, $200, all I had left to my name, and pressed it into the auctioneer's sweaty hand. A hush fell, like the desert itself was holding its breath. The auctioneer smirked, then sliced the rope with his knife. The sound of the cord snapping was small but final. She flinched, her eyes lifting to meet mine for the first time. They were dark, endless, filled with disbelief and a quiet fury that burned hotter than the noon sun. She didn't thank me, didn't even move at first. Gratitude wasn't what I was after. I wasn't sure what I was after anymore. When she finally stepped down, the crowd erupted in laughter and mockery. "Fool!" someone shouted. "You just bought trouble, Vance." Maybe I had. Trouble had a way of finding me, and this time she had the face of a woman who'd lost everything but her dignity. I untied my horse, mounted, and held out my hand to her. She stared at it for a long time, her fingers trembling before they slid into mine, small, cold, but strong. I pulled her up behind me, and without another word, we rode out of Dust Devil Pass. The air changed as soon as we left the town behind. The stench of whiskey and cruelty faded, replaced by the dry, healing scent of mesquite and sun-warmed rock. The road stretched before us, long and empty, carved through the desert like a scar. Neither of us spoke. She held herself stiff behind me, the hem of her tattered dress brushing my coat. I could feel her tension like a second heartbeat, every muscle on edge, waiting for betrayal. I didn't blame her. The world had given her no reason to believe in kindness. We rode for hours through land so vast it felt like the sky could swallow us whole. I thought of the $200 gone, of the bounty still waiting somewhere out there, and of the stranger now sharing my horse. I had no plan, no promise to offer, only the strange, quiet comfort of doing the one right thing I hadn't talked myself out of. Maybe it wasn't logic that drove me. It was the smallest fragment of my soul still trying to heal. The sun burned low as the desert turned gold and crimson. She shifted slightly, her hand brushing my arm for balance. That single touch sent something sharp and tender through me, a reminder that I was still human. The desert has a way of stripping men down to their bones, but in that moment I felt something return. A pulse of purpose, faint but alive. By dusk, the town had vanished behind us, swallowed by the horizon. Only the rhythm of hooves and her quiet breathing filled the silence. I knew she was exhausted, half-starved, afraid, and I was no savior worth believing in. Yet somewhere between the heat and the wind, a strange peace settled over us, fragile as the twilight itself. When we stopped by a dry creek bed, I dismounted first. She hesitated, eyes darting toward the open land like a trapped animal searching for escape. I said nothing, just untied a canteen, took a sip, then offered it to her. She took it slowly, her lips trembling as the water touched them. I could see how long it had been since anyone offered her something without expecting a price. The desert, cruel as it was, can also be a healer. It burns away the lies, leaves only what's true. As night fell, the stars came out in endless waves, stretching farther than the eye could follow. We built a small fire from dry sagebrush. She sat across from me, knees drawn to her chest, eyes reflecting the flames like mirrors of the past she didn't speak of. The silence between us wasn't empty anymore. It was fragile, sacred, a space where neither of us demanded answers. I spread my worn cavalry coat on the ground and leaned back against the saddle. She hesitated before lying down on the opposite side of the fire. The wind carried the faint scent of smoke and earth, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel alone. Maybe that was the healing I didn't know I needed, the presence of someone who didn't fill the silence, but made it bearable. Somewhere in that quiet, I realized I'd ridden into something deeper than duty. The desert had taken everything from me once, and now it was giving something back, a beginning I hadn't asked for but couldn't turn away from. If you've ever believed that redemption rides quietly beside us, unseen until the moment we choose it, then stay close to this story. Let it remind you that even in the loneliest places, kindness can still find its way through the dust. If this small spark of hope touched you, share it, leave a thought in the comments, or simply subscribe to stay a little longer on this trail. Out here, every heart that listens makes the silence a bit less lonely, and every story like this one finds its way home. The trail that wound out of Dust Devil Pass seemed endless, a ribbon of red earth stretching toward the horizon where the sun bled into the mountains. We rode without speaking, our shadows long and wavering across the sand. The air was cool now, carrying the scent of sage and mesquite, a small mercy after the heat of the day. Her hands rested lightly against the saddle horn, tense at first, then slowly easing as the horse's steady rhythm became her heartbeat. The sound of hooves against the hard ground was hypnotic, the kind of rhythm that settles into a man's bones and quiets the noise in his head. I could feel her breath at my back, faint and uncertain. The desert has a way of drawing out a man's truth. It strips him bare until there's nothing left but what's real. And what was real that night was the fragile space between us, filled with silence that didn't hurt, but healed. A silence that began to soften the edges of all the old wounds we both carried. I'd lived too long in the company of ghosts, but the warmth of her presence, even cloaked in fear, made them step back into the dark. We stopped by a shallow ravine where a few stunted mesquite trees offered the illusion of shelter. I dismounted first, my joints stiff from the long ride. She slid down carefully, her bare feet touching the cold earth. I handed her a blanket from my saddlebag, and though she hesitated, she took it and wrapped it around her shoulders. The way she held it close, as if unsure it would be taken away, reminded me of a wounded animal testing the world's cruelty. I turned away to gather wood. Sometimes kindness is loud. Sometimes it is quiet enough not to startle what is already broken. The fire crackled to life in slow, gentle pops. She sat across from me, knees pulled close, her dark eyes reflecting the flames like pools of melted amber. The shadows flickered across her face, softening the bruises, revealing the quiet strength beneath. I passed her a strip of dried meat. She accepted it with trembling fingers, eating in small bites, each movement careful, controlled. I said nothing. There was nothing worth saying. Words are cheap out here. Actions are the only language the desert respects. When she finally met my gaze, I saw the faintest question flicker in her eyes. Why had I done it? I didn't have an answer. Maybe I'd grown tired of being the kind of man who only took. Maybe I wanted to remember what it felt like to give, even if it meant losing everything. She turned her face toward the flames again, and in that moment, under the sky so wide it could swallow both our sorrows, something began to shift. It wasn't love yet. It was quieter, like the first soft rain after a drought, a promise of healing neither of us could name. When the fire died down to embers, I spread my coat on the ground and leaned back, my rifle within reach, my eyes on the stars. She lay a few feet away, her form a small shadow wrapped in the blanket. The desert wind brushed through the dry grass, whispering against the stones. I watched the faint rise and fall of her breathing until my own finally slowed to match it. The stars above seemed to pulse gently, like a heartbeat for the lonely. Morning came with a soft, pale light creeping through the canyon walls. She stirred before I did, sitting up, the blanket still clutched tight. I could see her eyes scanning the horizon, wary, unsure if freedom was real or just another trick of men. I rose and brewed coffee over the rekindled fire, the bitter scent curling into the cold air. I poured a small cup, pushed it toward her. She watched the steam rise, her fingers curling around the tin cup with careful reverence, like she was holding warmth for the first time in years. We rode again once the sun cleared the rocks. The landscape opened wide, a sea of copper hills and pale sky. Coyotes followed our trail for a while, curious ghosts that vanished when the light grew harsh. We crossed dry creek beds and cracked earth, each mile taking us farther from the cruelty of Dust Devil Pass and closer to something unnamed but necessary. I didn't know where I was leading her, only that I couldn't return her to the world that had laughed at her suffering. By midday, the heat returned with a vengeance. Sweat ran down my neck, and the horse's breath grew ragged. I saw the tremor in her hands as she clung to the saddle horn. Without a word, I slowed the horse near a jagged outcrop where a sliver of shadow clung to the rock. I dismounted, took her hand to steady her as she slid down. Her skin was warm, rough with dust, and when she looked up, our eyes met for the briefest heartbeat. Something in that look made time slow, the kind of quiet recognition that only exists between two people who've already lost too much. We shared the last of the water. She drank sparingly, her gaze flicking toward me as if expecting me to demand it back. I shook my head, and for the first time her lips softened. Not quite a smile, but something like it, fragile and healing. The world could break a woman like her 100 times, yet she still found the strength to lift her eyes to the horizon. That kind of strength humbled me more than any battlefield ever had. We reached my cabin at dusk, a half-collapsed stage station tucked into the arms of the canyon. Smoke from the last fire still clung faintly to the stones. I'd built the place up with what I had: rough hands, patience, and the need for solitude. To most, it was nothing but a ruin. To me, it was sanctuary. When she saw it, her eyes narrowed, searching for the trap. She didn't understand yet that safety can look like emptiness until you learn to breathe in it. I led the horse to the lean-to, unsaddled him, poured grain into the trough. She stood a few steps behind, wrapped in the blanket, her hair tangled by the wind. Inside, the cabin was small: a cot, a rough table, a stove. No luxury, only survival. I lit the lantern, its flame trembling across the walls. She followed hesitantly, eyes darting from corner to corner, her body tensed for danger that never came. I took my rifle from my shoulder, set it gently against the wall, then hung my coat beside it. Each gesture was slow, deliberate, so she would see that nothing here would hurt her. I filled a pot with water, poured in dried beans and a strip of salted meat. The smell soon filled the room, earthy and warm. She sat at the edge of the table, her eyes on the pot, her stomach betraying her with a soft growl. I pushed the bowl toward her when it was ready. She hesitated again, but took it, eating with small, measured bites. pausing as if waiting for punishment that never came. I looked away while she ate, pretending to study the fire, because mercy too sudden can be frightening. When she finished, she wiped the bowl clean with a small piece of bread and set it down quietly. Her hands were steady now, her breathing calmer. I gave her the cot and took the floor. She didn't argue, just stared at me a long while before lying down, still wrapped in the blanket, her face half hidden in shadow. I could hear her breathing as I lay there, the slow rhythm like a lullaby I hadn't known I missed. The next morning, the frost glittered on the ground like a million tiny shards of glass. I rose early, split kindling outside, the crack of the axe echoing through the canyon. She appeared in the doorway, wrapped in my old duster, watching me. Her hair caught the morning light, and for the first time her expression wasn't guarded. It was curious. I handed her the axe. She stared at it, puzzled, then tried a swing. The blade glanced off. She frowned, tried again, harder. This time it split clean. I nodded once, quiet approval. She exhaled sharply, and I saw it then, the faintest ghost of a smile. That small moment, so ordinary and wordless, felt like the first real breath of peace either of us had taken in years. There was something sacred in it, the healing rhythm of work, the shared pulse of two people learning to exist side by side without fear. The day passed in that silence made of small tasks, gathering wood, fetching water, mending what the desert had worn down. With each hour, the distance between us shrank, not through words, but through effort, trust forged one simple act at a time. When the sun began to sink, the sky turned a deep rose over the ridges. I sat on the porch, sharpening my knife, listening to the soft sounds of her moving inside. The smell of beans and sage drifted through the air. It was her doing. She had found the herbs I'd long forgotten, and somehow that simple act filled the place with something that felt like home. She served the food without speaking, but her eyes met mine briefly, calm now, almost steady. After the meal, I stood and fetched a folded shirt from a chest in the corner, a blue calico one that had belonged to my late wife. The memory of that woman was a shadow I carried, but it no longer bled when I touched it. I placed the shirt on the cot without a word and stepped outside. When I returned, Tayuna was wearing it, the torn dress folded neatly on the bed. It fit her loosely, but she held herself with new composure, like someone reclaiming her own skin. The firelight played gently across her face as she looked up. For a heartbeat, she seemed unsure whether to thank me or stay silent. Instead, she simply nodded. That was enough. Some gratitude doesn't need words, it speaks through peace itself. I poured 2 cups of coffee, handed her one. She took it, her fingers brushing mine. The warmth of that touch lingered longer than the heat of the cup. As the night deepened, she spoke for the first time, her voice soft and hesitant, shaped by an accent roughened by distance. "Mine, too," she said, touching the table. I frowned slightly, then understood. She meant the food, the place, the life beginning to grow between us. It was hers, too. I repeated the words, slower. Yours, too. Something in her eyes flickered, a spark of recognition, of belonging. She reached for the coat hanging by the fire and wrapped it around herself, the gesture tender, protective. I didn't move, just watched her settle near the stove, her face calm in the glow. The silence that followed was no longer heavy. It was alive. Outside, the wind sighed through the canyon, carrying the faint scent of rain far away. I lay down on the floor again, and as I drifted toward sleep, I realized that the emptiness I'd carried for so long was no longer hollow. It was filling, slowly, gently, with something fragile but real. The desert had taken everything from me once, but now, in its quiet, healing heart, it was giving something back. The night held us both like a soft breath, and for the first time, I didn't dream of loss. I dreamed of the small sound of her laughter, still unborn but waiting, somewhere on the horizon of what we were becoming. The days began to fold into one another like slow-moving clouds drifting across the pale Arizona sky. Each morning brought a rhythm that felt almost holy in its simplicity. The soft crack of kindling, the hiss of water boiling on the stove, the quiet exchange of glances that spoke louder than words ever could. The air grew colder as the sun rose later, and each dawn arrived with a silvery light that painted the world in peace. For the first time in years, I began to feel something I thought the war had stolen from me: stillness. Tayuna moved through the cabin like a soft shadow, her silence no longer a wall, but a song. The bruises on her face faded, replaced by a quiet strength that revealed itself in every gesture. She woke early to gather wood or fetch water from the creek, her hair tied back with a strip of cloth I'd cut from my old shirt. Her steps were light but sure, and when she worked, there was a focus in her movements that made the small space we shared feel like something alive, something whole. I found myself watching her more often than I intended. Not in the way a man watches a woman to claim her, but the way a man watches firelight in the dark, grateful for its warmth, afraid to breathe too hard lest it vanish. Every time she brushed past me, the faint scent of sage and smoke clung to her, and it reminded me that even broken things can bloom in the right soil. The silence between us began to shift into comfort, that kind of healing quiet that doesn't demand, only exists. One morning, while the frost still clung to the window, she stood near the stove, stirring beans in the pot. The sun had just begun to reach across the floorboards, and the light caught in her hair like liquid bronze. When she turned to hand me a bowl, our fingers brushed. It was a small thing, a fleeting moment, but the look that passed between us lingered longer than it should have. There was no fear in her eyes this time, only recognition. A quiet understanding that whatever bound us together now wasn't ownership or debt, but something gentler, something growing out of the ashes of everything we'd lost. Later that day, I took her out to the paddock, where my 2 horses grazed among the scrub. She followed me, her steps cautious at first, then steadier. I showed her how to brush their coats, to check their hooves for stones, to speak softly so they'd trust her. She listened with intent, her eyes sharp and curious. The horses seemed to sense her spirit, wild yet calm, and when one of them nudged her shoulder, she didn't flinch. Instead, she reached up and laid her hand on its neck. For the first time since I'd met her, I saw her smile. Not a half-formed twitch, but a real soft curve that made the world seem less cruel. We worked side by side for hours. The sun climbed high, and sweat beaded on our skin, but it didn't matter. There was a peace in that labor, a sense of shared purpose that stitched our 2 fractured lives together, thread by thread. When she looked at me across the paddock, her eyes steady and unguarded, I felt something inside me shift, a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying beginning to lift. The desert wind brushed past, carrying the faint scent of juniper, and for a heartbeat I thought maybe the land itself approved. That evening, as the shadows lengthened and the mountains turned the color of old copper, I found her sitting on the porch, mending a tear in her dress. The light caught the curve of her cheek, and I could see the careful concentration in her fingers as she worked. I sat down beside her, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her skin, but not close enough to frighten her. For a long while we said nothing. Then she held up the repaired fabric, smiled faintly, and handed it to me as if to show her progress. "Good," I said simply. My voice sounded strange, too soft for a man used to the hard edges of solitude. She nodded once, then looked out at the horizon. The sky was wide and quiet, the first stars beginning to appear. For a moment, the world felt like it was holding its breath. She spoke again, her voice a whisper carried by the wind. "You, no hurt," she said slowly, the words awkward but certain. I looked at her, and the meaning hit me harder than any bullet ever had. "No," I said, shaking my head. "No hurt." Something eased in her shoulders. She folded her hands in her lap, the needle still between her fingers. Her lips moved again, forming a word I didn't understand, something in her own tongue that sounded like a prayer. Whatever it was, it softened the air between us. That night I found myself lying awake long after the fire had burned low. The sound of her breathing filled the small cabin, steady and calm. I stared at the ceiling, tracing the shadows that danced there, and realized that the silence I once feared had become the thing I looked forward to most. There was a kind of healing in it, the kind that seeps into your bones and teaches you to breathe again. The days passed, and our small world began to take shape. I showed her how to clean the rifle, how to mend a saddle strap, how to tell when the weather was turning. She learned quickly, her mind sharp and hungry, and in return she taught me something I hadn't known I needed to learn again: how to slow down, how to be gentle, how to live without expecting the next loss to come crashing down. Sometimes she would hum softly as she worked, a low melody that carried the weight of her people, her past, and the desert itself. The sound filled the cabin like sunlight, washing away the ghosts that had lived there too long. I would find myself listening, closing my eyes and letting it pour through me until the ache inside eased. It wasn't love yet, but it was its beginning, the slow, steady blooming of trust. One afternoon, a storm rolled in from the west. The wind howled through the canyon, shaking the old shutters, and the sky turned the color of lead. I brought the horses into the lean-to while Tayuna secured the firewood. When the rain came, it fell hard, pounding the roof like a drum. The air turned cold, and we huddled near the stove, the sound of the storm wrapping around us like a blanket. She shivered, her shoulders tense beneath the fabric of my old coat. I stood, took a wool blanket from the chest, and draped it over her. She looked up, her eyes shining in the firelight, and whispered something soft. It might have been thanks, or maybe it was just the sound of her heart finding its voice again. Either way, I nodded, and we sat there in silence, the rain cleansing the dust from the world outside. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a freshness that smelled of pine and wet earth. The world felt reborn. She stepped outside, her bare feet sinking into the soft mud, and looked at the mountains glistening under the first light. I watched her as she tilted her face to the sky, letting the wind lift her hair, her expression calm and free. For that moment, she didn't look like someone who had been broken by cruelty. She looked like someone the earth itself was learning to forgive. When she turned and saw me watching, she didn't look away. Instead, she smiled faintly, and the sight of it felt like a prayer answered in silence. I didn't speak. Words would have ruined it. Later that day, as the sun returned and the air warmed, I took her down to the creek. The water was cold, clear, running fast from the mountains. We washed our clothes side by side, the water numbing our hands, and she laughed softly when I tried to wring out my shirt and splashed myself instead. That sound, light, unguarded, was like hearing spring in the middle of winter. I looked up, startled, and saw her laughing, the sound rolling out into the canyon like a blessing. It struck me then how far we had come from that auction square, the cruelty, the humiliation, the fear. She was still the same woman, but the fire in her was no longer just defiance. It was life itself. She had taken the silence I gave her and filled it with her own music. That night she cooked again, using herbs she'd gathered near the creek. The food tasted richer than anything I'd had in years. After we ate, she sat by the fire, sewing something small. When I asked, she lifted it up, a strip of leather, carefully threaded with beads made from bone and seed. She handed it to me, her eyes soft. "For horse," she said. I took it, feeling the rough texture under my thumb. It was a gift, one made not from gratitude but from care. That difference mattered. As the fire died, I felt the weight of the day settle into me. But it was a good weight, the kind that comes from work, from peace, from knowing you are not entirely alone anymore. I leaned back, watching her in the flickering light, and thought how strange it was that a man could spend half his life searching for purpose and then find it not in words or glory, but in the quiet company of a woman who spoke almost none. Outside, the wind whispered softly through the sagebrush, carrying the scent of rain and renewal. The desert was healing, and so were we. I closed my eyes, listening to her breathing blend with the night, and for the first time in years I felt the warmth of something sacred taking root where the emptiness had once been. Tomorrow would come, as it always does, with its new weight and new work. But tonight there was peace, fragile, fleeting, and utterly real. It was enough. The thaw came slowly that year, as if the desert itself was uncertain about forgiving the cold. The frost still clung to the shadows in the canyon, but the mornings grew softer, the wind carrying the scent of melting snow from the higher ridges. Days stretched longer, gold and quiet, and life at the way station fell into a rhythm so steady it felt almost holy. There was no promise spoken between us, no line drawn to mark what we were. Yet each shared moment began to feel like the steady pulse of something that had always meant to be. Tayuna was no longer the frightened woman I had lifted from that wagon. The hard edge of fear had faded from her eyes, replaced by a calm strength that could only come from survival. She worked beside me every day, her movements sure, her hands calloused, her silence now filled with purpose instead of pain. When she walked through the small yard, her bare feet left faint prints in the dust, and I would catch myself watching the way the light gathered in her hair, as if the sun itself had chosen her as its keeper. One afternoon, while patching the roof with tin sheets, I looked down to see her below, hanging laundry between two wooden posts. The fabric rippled in the wind, white against the copper sky, and for a moment I was struck by the simple beauty of it, how a woman's quiet work could make a lonely place look like home. She glanced up and caught me staring. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. Then she smiled, that soft, fleeting smile that always undid me, and went back to her task. Inside the cabin, the scent of sage lingered. She'd hung small bundles from the rafters, saying nothing, just letting their fragrance fill the air. The place had begun to change under her hands. Where I once saw survival, she saw life waiting to bloom. There was a woven mat by the door now, a clay bowl for washing, and dried flowers in an old tin cup on the table. Her touch didn't erase the past. It softened it as rain softens stone over time. At night, the fire burned low and the silence grew tender. She would sit by the stove, her legs drawn beneath her, mending or carving small shapes from wood. Sometimes I'd watch her, the golden light playing across her skin, and wonder how a man like me, worn, scarred, and hollowed out by loss, had stumbled into the grace of such quiet companionship. She didn't ask questions about the war or the ghosts that haunted me. She simply existed beside me, steady and real, until my silence began to heal. One evening, as dusk settled and the canyon filled with the sound of crickets, she brought me something unexpected, a shirt. My wife's old calico, the one I'd buried deep in a chest years ago. She had found it folded among the remnants of another life, washed it, mended the seams, and now held it out with both hands. I froze, memory hitting like the kick of a rifle. She must have seen the flicker of pain cross my face because she lowered her eyes and began to pull the shirt back. I stopped her, reached out, and gently placed my hand over hers. "Keep it," I said quietly. My voice sounded rough, foreign to my own ears. "Yours now." She looked up, and something unspoken passed between us. Gratitude, perhaps, or something older, an understanding that the past cannot be undone, only carried forward gently, like an old scar. That night she wore the shirt, the sleeves rolled up, the fabric soft against her skin. The sight of her standing there, framed by the firelight, wearing the ghost of a life I'd thought buried, should have hurt. Instead, it brought peace, the kind that seeps into the soul like warm rain through dry soil. We ate dinner in silence. When I nodded my thanks for the meal, her lips curved in that quiet way that said she understood far more than my words could ever express. Later, she sat on the cot, running her fingers over the worn fabric of the shirt, her face calm and thoughtful. "Mine," she murmured softly, tapping the fabric, then pointing toward the table, the fire, and finally toward me. "Mine too." The simplicity of it shattered me. She wasn't claiming possession, she was claiming belonging. In her broken English, she was saying what I'd been too proud to admit, that this place, this life, was no longer mine alone. I swallowed hard, nodding once. "Yours too," I said. She smiled, small and real, and the world felt right again. In the days that followed, the connection between us deepened in quiet, unspoken ways. I taught her how to load the rifle, not because I expected trouble, but because a woman who has been caged should never again be unarmed. She learned fast, her eyes sharp, her hands steady. When she fired her first shot and hit the bottle we'd set on a post, she turned to me, pride gleaming like sunlight in her gaze. I laughed, a sound so rare it startled even me. She laughed too, that soft, melodic laugh I'd come to crave, and the canyon echoed with something alive, something joyful. The land around us began to change as the seasons shifted. Wild flowers bloomed in the dry gullies, splashes of purple and gold against the red soil. Birds returned, and their morning calls became part of our waking hours. We worked together, repaired fences, mended saddles, and took turns gathering from the traps I'd set near the creek. Each task felt lighter with her beside me. Her presence didn't fill the silence. It gave it warmth, turning solitude into companionship. At night, the air turned cold again, and I would see her by the fire, wrapped in my coat, her hair falling loose over her shoulders. Sometimes she'd hum softly, a song I didn't know, in a language I couldn't understand. But the melody held peace, the kind that seeps through walls and finds the heart beneath the armor. I would sit across from her, listening, feeling the ache of years fade into something softer. One evening, as I was chopping wood outside, I heard her call my name for the first time. "Silas!" My name in her mouth was soft, rounded, almost hesitant, yet it felt like the first drop of rain on desert dust. I looked over. She was standing in the doorway, her eyes glowing in the twilight, a small cut on her hand where she'd been preparing supper. I crossed the yard quickly, took her hand without thinking, and examined the wound. It was shallow, a slice from the knife's edge, but her blood against her copper skin made my chest tighten. I fetched a clean cloth, wrapped her hand carefully. She watched me, her face calm, the firelight flickering behind her. "No pain," she whispered, testing the word like she was tasting it for the first time. "Healing." "Yes," I said quietly. "Healing." The word lingered in the air between us, echoing deeper than its meaning. We stood there, her hand still in mine, our breath mingling in the cool air. For the first time, I didn't pull away. The night seemed to bend around us, the stars slow to appear, as if even the heavens wanted to give us this moment. After that night, something unspoken changed. We didn't talk about it. We didn't have to. The space between us grew warmer, steadier. When I rose before dawn to start the fire, she was already there, handing me the flint. When I worked in the yard, she brought water. When I grew quiet, lost in thought, she would hum that song again, soft and low, pulling me back to the present. One morning, I found her sitting by the creek, the hem of her calico shirt damp, her reflection shimmering in the water. She was weaving something from tall grass, thin strands twisting together into a small circle. When she saw me, she lifted it up with a shy pride. It was a wreath, rough but beautiful. She stood, stepped close, and before I could speak, she placed it gently on my head. I must have looked ridiculous, a grizzled old cavalryman with a crown of grass, but she laughed, a sound so pure it made my heart ache. I laughed too, and for that small stretch of time, the world felt new again. When the sun set that evening, the horizon turned the color of fire, and the desert looked like it was breathing. She stood beside me at the edge of the porch, the wind tugging at her hair. I glanced at her, saw the faint smile playing on her lips, and felt something settle inside me, an acceptance of all that had come before and all that might come next. There was no need for words. The silence between us said everything. That night, after she had fallen asleep on the cot, I sat by the dying fire, watching the last embers glow. My hands were rough, my heart old and scarred, but for the first time in decades, I didn't feel hollow. The warmth in the room wasn't just from the fire. It was from her, from the life we had built together, fragile and unspoken, but real. I thought of how far we'd come from that cruel square in Dust Devil Pass, from blood and humiliation to this, quiet, safety, belonging. The desert outside hummed softly, a lullaby made of wind and distant stars. I closed my eyes, letting the peace sink into my bones. Tomorrow I would ride out to settle a debt of my own. But tonight, under the shelter of her steady breathing, I allowed myself to rest in the healing warmth of something that felt dangerously close to love. The fifth morning came wrapped in mist, the kind that rolls through the canyon like a ghost trying to find its way home. The air was cool, soft against the skin, carrying the scent of wet stone and pine. The small fire inside the cabin had burned low, a faint orange glow licking at the last bits of wood. I woke before the light fully broke, the quiet so deep I could hear the rhythm of her breathing across the room. For a long while I just lay there, watching the smoke curl toward the ceiling and fade into nothing. When I finally rose, I moved carefully, not to disturb her sleep. Tayuna lay curled beneath the wool blanket, her dark hair spilling across the pillow like a river of night. Her face, in that moment of rest, looked younger, free of the shadows that had once clung to her like a second skin. She had fought hard for this peace, and I would have given anything to keep it unbroken. I stepped outside into the chill dawn, the sky still grey, and felt the first warmth of sunlight brush against the canyon walls. The world felt new again, tender and forgiving, as though it too was learning to heal. Life with her had begun to take on a rhythm that felt like prayer. We spoke little, yet we understood much. The mornings belonged to the land, the quiet labor of mending fences, checking traps, gathering water. The afternoons were softer, filled with the small domestic rituals she had brought into my life. Herbs hanging from the rafters, the steady hum of her song while she cooked, the brush of her fingers when she passed me bread. I had once thought silence was the sound of loneliness, but now I knew it could be a language of trust. One morning, as the sun broke through, I found her outside near the paddock, kneeling by a small patch of earth she had cleared. She was digging with her hands, the soil dark against her skin. I walked closer, the sound of my boots crunching over the dry ground. She looked up, her eyes bright. "Plant," she said, pointing to the small pouch of seeds beside her. I knelt beside her, taking the seeds into my palm. They were tiny things, fragile and full of promise. "Too cold yet," I said softly. She smiled, shaking her head. "Sun come," she replied, pressing one seed into the dirt. "Grow." It wasn't about the seeds. It was about belief. In that single gesture she was teaching me something the desert had long forgotten, to trust in what can bloom after winter. I helped her cover the small patch, smoothing the earth with the back of my hand. For the rest of the day I carried the faint scent of soil on my fingers, and it reminded me of her, rooted, resilient, and quietly alive. As the days lengthened, warmth returned to the land. The ice on the creek broke, and the first green shoots appeared in the valley below. Tayuna spent more time outside, gathering wild herbs and weaving thin ropes of grass. Sometimes she'd return with flowers tucked behind her ear, and the sight of it, so small, so human, made something in my chest loosen. I'd forgotten how beauty could be simple, unspoken, healing. One evening, after a long day repairing the corral, I found her sitting near the fire with a small piece of hide stretched across her lap. She was drawing on it with charcoal, her movements patient and deliberate. When I sat beside her, she lifted it for me to see. It was a sketch, crude but clear, of the two of us standing beside the cabin, a tiny curl of smoke rising from the chimney. The horse grazed nearby, and the mountains towered in the distance. She tapped her finger against the smaller figure, hers, and said softly, "Here." Then she touched the taller one, mine, and added, "Here." I didn't need translation. It was a picture of belonging, a map of a life she had chosen to claim, one that neither chains nor papers had given her. I took the charcoal from her hand, added a single line above us both, the outline of a bird, wings outstretched. She smiled at the sight of it. "Kestrel," I said. "Free." Her eyes softened, and she traced the word in the air, repeating it under her breath like a prayer. That night, we ate by the fire, and when she set my bowl down, her fingers lingered on mine. There was no need for words. Everything that mattered passed through that touch, the trust we'd built, the quiet tenderness that had taken root in both of us. After dinner, she stood near the doorway, looking out into the dark. The moonlight caught the edge of her face, turning her features silver. "Before," she whispered, "dark in heart. Now." She placed her hand over her chest, then looked at me. "Light." Her words, broken but full of truth, reached deep into me. I walked to her, close enough to feel the warmth of her skin, and said softly, "You brought it." She shook her head, her lips curving into the faintest smile. "We," she said simply. We stood like that for a long while, the desert breathing around us, the night alive with quiet miracles. Outside, the wind rustled through the sagebrush, carrying the scent of life returning. Inside, the fire burned low, and in its glow I saw what love looked like when it wasn't shouted or sworn. It was steady, patient, and built from kindness. Days later, I had to ride out again. The bounty I'd been chasing was still out there, unfinished business waiting beyond the ridges. I saddled my horse before dawn, the cold air sharp enough to sting my lungs. Tayuna stood by the door, the rifle slung across her shoulder, her expression unreadable. She had grown stronger, her gaze steady, her back straight. 2 days, I said, holding up 2 fingers. She nodded. 2. I handed her the Winchester, showing her again how to check the chamber, how to aim. She didn't need reminding, but it felt right. When I turned to mount the horse, she stepped forward, pressed my canteen into my hand, and said one word that stayed with me long after I rode away. "Come." It wasn't a plea, it was faith, a promise that there was something to return to. The road was long and harsh. I tracked the outlaw across dry gullies and over ridges, through a land so empty that even the wind seemed to have forgotten its song. I found him on the 3rd day, asleep by the ruins of an old logging camp. The encounter was brief, a blur of noise and movement. When it was done, he lay still, and the world fell quiet again. I bound him across his horse and began the long ride home. When I reached the canyon, smoke was rising. My heart clenched. I spurred the horse hard, fear like fire in my veins. The cabin came into view. Shattered door, scorched roof. The yard, a chaos of footprints and broken things. I threw myself from the saddle, the taste of iron in my mouth. Inside, the air smelled of gunpowder and ash. I called her name once, and the echo came back empty. Then I heard it, a faint sound from the corner, a low, steady breath. She was there, sitting against the wall, blood on her shoulder, the rifle resting across her knees. Her eyes found me immediately. Pain was written across her face, but not fear. I knelt beside her, my hands trembling as I checked the wound. "Holt's men," she murmured, her voice raw. "3, want Kestrel." Her English was halting, but clear enough. I looked around, the shattered window, the burn marks on the floor, and understood. She had fought them off, alone. My throat tightened as I cleaned the wound and wrapped it with cloth. She winced, but did not cry out. "They gone," she said softly. 2 run, 1. She nodded toward a dark stain near the door. I followed her gaze and saw it, the outline of a man who would never rise again. She had defended what was ours with the same fierce courage that had once defied a crowd of drunken men. Only now she wasn't defending her pride. She was defending her home. When I finished tending the wound, she leaned her head against my chest. For the first time, I felt her weight fully, not as a burden, but as a truth. "Husband?" she said suddenly, the word thick with emotion, her hand pressed against her heart. "Gone. Mine too." Her meaning was simple. Loss was our shared language. I swallowed hard, my voice rough. "Wife died here," I said. "Child too. Long ago." The words came like stones, heavy but freeing. She looked up, her eyes shining with something beyond sorrow. "Not alone," she whispered. I held her then, careful of her wound, my arm around her shoulders. The silence that filled the room wasn't empty. It was full of understanding, of forgiveness, of something that felt like salvation. The fire outside had burned itself out, but the warmth between us remained steady and real. When she finally slept, I stayed awake beside her, watching the rise and fall of her breath. The world outside might still be cruel, but here, in this broken cabin, there was a peace no violence could touch. I reached for her hand and held it lightly, feeling the pulse beneath her skin. A fragile, living proof that what we had built, though small, was something worth fighting for. The dawn crept slowly through the cracks in the wall, spilling light across the floor where the ashes of the fire still glowed. I knew what had to come next, the debt that had to be settled, the justice that had to be restored. But before the storm, there was this quiet, this healing, this rare and sacred love that had found its home in 2 weary souls who had almost forgotten how to live. The morning after the fire smelled of smoke and iron. The light crept through the canyon like a prayer whispered too quietly for the sky to hear. The wind carried the ashes of what had been burned, but it also carried renewal, the scent of something beginning again. I woke with Tayuna's head resting lightly on my shoulder, her breath soft and even, her hand curled near my chest. For a long time, I didn't move. There was peace in that stillness, fragile as morning frost, but it was peace nonetheless. Her shoulder was bandaged, the wound cleaned, the fever gone. I brushed a loose strand of hair from her face, careful not to wake her. The way the light touched her skin made her look otherworldly, like a spirit who'd wandered into my life to remind me that not everything the world takes stays gone. Outside, the world was quiet again. No riders, no shouting, no echo of violence, just the hush of the desert after it has forgiven the night. When she stirred, her eyes met mine immediately. There was pain there, but beneath it, something else. Resolve. She reached up, her fingers tracing the rough stubble on my jaw, and for a moment I forgot every scar I'd ever carried. "Stay," I said softly, though the word wasn't a command. It was a plea, a promise. She nodded once, understanding without needing translation. I rose, pulling on my coat, the familiar weight of the Colt on my hip grounding me in what had to come next. Holt had sent his men here, and by doing so, he'd crossed a line that even this unforgiving land wouldn't excuse. There are debts written in blood that only honor can pay, and mine was long overdue. Tayuna sat up, watching me with eyes sharp and calm. "You go," she said quietly, the words careful but sure. "I keep here." Her voice was soft, but there was no fear in it. I hesitated, torn between duty and the ache of leaving her again. But when she stood, pulling my rifle closer and resting it against her good shoulder, I knew she didn't need my protection anymore, only my trust. I saddled the horse in silence. The ground was still marked with the tracks of the men who'd come in the night. I followed them out of the canyon, every step of the horse's hooves pressing into the memory of what they'd tried to take. The desert stretched wide before me, endless and waiting, its horizon shimmering with heat. As I rode, the past rose around me like dust. I thought of my wife, buried under Virginia clay, of the child I'd never held, of the long years I'd spent letting the silence eat through me. Every mile felt like a reckoning, not just for Holt, but for the man I had become when grief had hollowed me out. Somewhere behind me, in that small cabin of smoke and stone, was the one thing the war hadn't taught me to destroy. I would not let the world take her too. It took half a day to find them. Holt's men weren't subtle. They'd made camp near an old copper mine, the remains of their fire still smoking. I counted 3 horses, 2 men asleep, and 1 standing guard with a bottle in hand. The sight was familiar. The arrogance of those who believed cruelty was the same thing as power. I dismounted quietly, looped the reins around a low branch, and moved through the brush with the slow patience of an old soldier. When I stepped out, the guard saw me too late. My Colt cleared leather before he could raise his pistol. 1 shot, clean and final. The others woke in a frenzy, reaching for weapons they'd left too far from their hands. I didn't shout, didn't curse. The desert has no need for words when it deals in justice. The first man fell by the fire, the second stumbled into the dirt with fear in his eyes and regret on his lips. I left him breathing. Let him carry the story back. Let Holt know that his reach had found its end. When it was over, the silence felt heavy again, but not empty. I stood there for a long while, the wind tugging at my coat, the sun burning the back of my neck. The rage that had driven me there drained away, leaving only the ache of exhaustion. I buried the bodies beneath a ridge of red rock, covered the loose soil with stones, and whispered something that wasn't quite forgiveness, but close enough to peace. By the time I rode back, the sun was falling behind the mountains, the sky bleeding gold into purple. Smoke rose faintly from the chimney of the cabin. I felt the tightness in my chest ease. She was alive, waiting. I spurred the horse into a faster trot, the sound of hooves echoing off the canyon walls like a heartbeat returning home. When I reached the clearing, Tayuna was standing by the doorway, her hair loose, her shoulder bound clean, the rifle still near her hand. She didn't run to me, and I didn't expect her to. That wasn't her way, and it wasn't mine. But her eyes softened when they met mine, and that was enough. I dismounted, pulled the rolled parchment from my saddlebag, and set it on the table inside. She followed me in, her gaze moving from the paper to my face. I pointed to it. "Land," I said. "Ours." She frowned slightly, not understanding. I unrolled the deed, showing her the marks, the seal, the ink still dark. "Paper say, 'Belong here,'" I added, tapping the floor with my boot. She was silent for a moment, then lifted her chin. "No paper," she said finally, the words slow but strong. "Home is here." She pressed her hand against her chest, then to the table, to the walls, to me. I understood. What she meant couldn't be written in law. It was carved in the simple truth of surviving together, of finding peace where no peace had been before. That night, we sat by the fire as the wind howled outside. The air was sharp with cold, but the warmth between us held steady. She rested against me, her uninjured shoulder fitting perfectly against my chest. I told her about Holt's men, about how it was done, though not in the kind of detail that blood demands. She didn't ask for more. She only listened, her breath sinking with mine. When I reached for the small tin cup by the fire, she took it from my hand, her fingers brushing mine, steady and deliberate. "No more fight," she said softly, her accent wrapping the words in gentleness. "Enough." I nodded, though I knew peace was rarely something a man could keep forever. Still, her faith in it felt like sunlight through the cold. In the days that followed, the quiet returned. We rebuilt the door, cleared the debris, patched the roof with new boards. Every sound of hammer and nail felt like healing, like turning a wound into a scar. The land itself seemed to notice. Birds began to return, their calls breaking the silence. Even the soil where she had planted her seeds began to show small green shoots, tender and alive. She spent hours there, her hands in the dirt, humming softly. I'd watch from the porch, a cup of coffee in hand, and think how strange it was that a man who once measured his worth by bullets now found meaning in watching a woman tend to a patch of earth. It was slow work, patient and pure, and maybe that's what redemption looks like, not thunder or glory, but quiet mornings where nothing hurts and nothing needs to be said. One afternoon she came to me holding something small in her hands. A sprout, its leaves trembling in the wind. "Grow," she said simply, smiling. I took it from her, the fragile stem barely as long as my finger, and felt something stir in my chest that I hadn't felt in years. "Yes," I said, "grow." The word stayed with me long after she'd gone back to her garden. Grow. It was what she had done in this barren land, what she had made me do without even trying. When night came, the stars stretched wide across the sky, clear and endless. She sat beside me on the porch, the fire inside casting a warm glow through the open door. The smell of wood smoke mixed with the scent of sage and soil. She leaned her head on my shoulder, her hand resting lightly over mine. The world beyond our canyon might still be cruel, But here, in this pocket of peace carved by survival and tenderness, we had built something that even the wind respected. I turned my head slightly, pressing a kiss to her hair. She didn't move, didn't speak, but I felt her smile against my arm. That small, wordless moment carried more promise than any vow could. Tomorrow, I would ride to Tombstone to settle the bounty, to claim the last piece of unfinished business that tethered me to the old world. But tonight, under the silver wash of moonlight and the soft hum of her breath, I allowed myself to believe in the simple, healing truth that sometimes love doesn't rescue, it rebuilds. It takes the ashes, the silence, and the sorrow, and turns them into something that breathes, something that grows. The desert outside was wide and endless, but for the first time it didn't feel lonely. It felt like home. The road to Tombstone was a narrow scar across the desert, winding through dry gullies and wind-polished stone. I left at dawn, when the light was still soft and the air smelled of last night's fire. Tayuna stood at the doorway as I mounted, wrapped in my old coat, her hair loose and dark against the pale morning. She didn't speak, but her eyes held mine, calm and unafraid. I touched the brim of my hat and nodded once, the kind of promise that needs no words. Then I turned the horse east and rode into the open land, the sound of hooves fading into the hush of daybreak. The desert stretched endless before me, a place of ghosts and memory. Every mile between us felt heavier than the one before, but the silence out there wasn't empty. It was alive, whispering the truth of what I carried with me. I wasn't riding away to escape her. I was riding to secure what we had built. Holt's shadow still lingered in the territory, a long reach of greed and arrogance. Men like him believed that paper and law could make them kings. I'd seen too many such men fall, but this time I wanted to do more than fight them. I wanted to outlast them. When I reached Tombstone, the streets were dust and noise. The hammer of boots, the whinny of horses, the hiss of a piano somewhere behind swinging saloon doors. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and lies. I rode straight past the noise toward the sheriff's office, where I turned in the bounty. The outlaw's body had been delivered, the deed witnessed, the justice clean and cold. The sheriff, a weary man with eyes like dried leather, counted out the $500, each bill crisp with the weight of blood-earned redemption. I took the money, folded it once, and slipped it into my coat. But I didn't head to the saloon. I went instead to the telegraph office, where the smell of ink and oil clung to the walls. The clerk looked up from his papers, startled by the sight of a dust-covered rider. "Land patent," I said. "Need it filed proper." He nodded, fumbling with his forms. I laid the deed on the counter, the same paper I had carried through wind and fire. "Name it Vance," I said, "Silas Vance, and mark it for the Dragoon foothills, Station Valley." The clerk wrote quickly, the scratch of his pen echoing in the quiet room. When he handed me the official seal, the paper now bore the weight of law. For the first time in my life, I owned something not taken by violence. Not a weapon, not a grave, but a piece of earth. Home. I looked down at my name, inked across the bottom, and thought of her, of the way she'd stood in the sunlight, her hands in the dirt, her voice saying, "Grow." This was for her, though she would never have asked for it. By the time I left Tombstone, the sun was dipping low, painting the world in copper and gold. I bought a few supplies, flour, salt, fresh coffee beans, a new blanket, and tied them to my saddle. The road home waited long and empty, the kind of road that tests a man's patience and faith. But I didn't mind. Each mile brought me closer to her, to the life we'd carved from silence and ruin. I reached Dust Devil Pass by twilight. The town hadn't changed. Still the same cracked boards, the same hollow laughter spilling from saloon doors. But the men stopped talking when I rode through. Maybe they remembered me from that day at the auction. Maybe they just felt the kind of quiet that carries danger in its shadow. I didn't stop. I had no more business in that place. Justice had already been spoken in gunfire and resolve. When I finally saw the ridge that led down into our valley, the last of the light was fading. Smoke rose thin from the chimney, a sign that she was there, waiting. My chest loosened with relief. The horse quickened its pace, hooves striking sparks from the rocks. I rode down through the darkening canyon until the cabin appeared, small and glowing against the mountain's shadow. She was outside when I arrived, standing by the fence, her figure outlined by the firelight from inside. The rifle rested beside her, though she didn't need it now. When she saw me, she smiled, soft, weary, but real. I dismounted, my legs stiff, and she met me halfway across the yard. Neither of us spoke. Words would have only lessened the moment. She reached out first, her fingers brushing the dust from my coat, and I felt the tremor in her hand. Then she pressed her palm to my chest, over my heart, as if to reassure herself it still beat. Inside, I set the rolled deed on the table. The lamp's light caught the seal, gleaming faintly. "This," I said, pointing to it. "Ours." She tilted her head, her eyes questioning, not of the paper, but of the meaning behind it. I explained slowly, choosing words she'd learned. Home, safe, no man take. She looked at me for a long time, then at the fire, the rifle, the walls she had repaired with her own hands. "Paper not keep," she said finally, her voice gentle. "Heart keep." She was right, of course. The law could burn, land could be stolen. But what we'd built, our small, unspoken bond, was beyond the reach of greed. Still, I wanted her to know she would never again be a possession, never again be at the mercy of another man's cruelty. Later that night, the knock of hooves broke the quiet. 2 riders approached through the dark. I stepped outside before they reached the yard, the colt heavy at my side. Tayuna stayed behind the door, her shadow steady against the firelight. When the riders came close enough for me to see their faces, I recognized them, Holt's men. The same foreman who had laughed the loudest at the auction now sat sneering in the saddle. "Well," he said, voice slurred with whiskey, "the preacher boy returns. Heard you bought yourself a Navajo bride. Holt wants what's his." "She's not his," I said quietly, "and this is my land now." I held up the deed, letting the seal catch the light. "Tell Holt it's done." The man spat into the dirt. "Law don't mean much around here. Holt owns this county." I took a step forward, my voice low and even. "Not anymore." His hand twitched toward his holster, and before the motion was half finished, my Colt cleared leather. The shot cracked the air, echoing off the canyon walls. His hat flew from his head, the bullet burying itself in the dirt an inch from his boot. The other rider jerked his reins, turning his horse sharply. "Tell Holt," I said, the words flat and cold. "Next time, I aim higher." They rode off fast, swallowed by the darkness. I stood there until their hoofbeats vanished, the smoke from my gun curling up like a final warning. When I turned back, Tayuna was standing in the doorway, the rifle cradled in her arms, but her face calm. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't need to. She crossed the room, took the pistol from my hand, and set it on the table. Then she placed her hand over mine. "Enough," she said softly. "No more kill. We live now." I nodded, and the last of the anger drained from me like water from cracked earth. The fight was over. For the first time, I believed it. That night, I took the small ring I'd carried for years, a tarnished silver band that had belonged to my mother, and placed it on the table between us. "I have nothing fine," I said, "only honor and my shoulder when storms come." She studied the ring, her fingers tracing its worn edges. Then she looked up at me, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "I choose," she whispered. "Partner." The word settled in the air like the closing of a circle, the end of all debts. I took her hand and slid the ring onto her finger. It fit loosely, but she smiled as if it had been made for her. She leaned forward then, her forehead resting lightly against mine. The air between us was full of warmth, of gratitude, of something sacred that required no witness but the wind. Outside, the stars burned bright, watching without judgment. Inside, the fire glowed low, its light spilling across the floorboards. We sat in silence, her head resting against my chest, the sound of her breathing merging with mine. I felt the weight of years lift, replaced by a quiet sense of belonging. Not the loud, desperate kind of love that burns and destroys, but the gentle, healing kind that rebuilds without asking for permission. Before sleep took me, I looked down at her hand resting against my heart, the small silver ring glinting in the firelight. For the first time since I'd buried my family, the world didn't feel empty. It felt alive. It felt forgiven. Morning came with soft light spilling over the mountains. She rose before me, moving quietly around the cabin, her figure graceful in the stillness. When she stepped outside, the wind lifted her hair, and the sound of her laughter carried faintly through the canyon. I followed, watching as she stood at the edge of the valley, her eyes on the horizon. She turned, smiling, and I knew then that this, our fragile peace, our shared breath, wasn't the end of the road. It was the beginning of the one we would walk together. The desert had once taken everything from me, but now it had given something back. A love born not from chance, but from choice. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't perfect. It was steady, tender, healing. And as the wind swept over the land, carrying the scent of sage and dust and renewal, I finally understood. The truest kind of home is not built with wood or stone, but with the quiet courage to stay when everything in you once learned to leave. The sun broke over the Dragoon Mountains like a soft confession, gold and rose spilling through the gaps between the jagged peaks. The light touched everything it could reach, the stones by the creek, the worn door of our cabin, the strands of her hair as she bent over the small patch of corn that had grown taller than her knee. The air was warm already, filled with that patient hum that only comes after survival, the hum of insects, of wind against dry grass, of life learning once again how to trust the morning. I stood by the fence, tightening a rail, watching her move. The earth around her had darkened with water. Her bare feet left small prints that vanished as quickly as she made them. When she straightened and saw me looking, she smiled in that quiet, knowing way that always felt like sunlight after too long in shadow. For months, that smile had been teaching me what the war and the years alone had tried to make me forget. That peace is not the absence of scars, but the ability to breathe with them, to let light fall through their edges until even hurt begins to bloom. The land had changed since the first day I rode in here, with nothing but debt in my pockets and ghosts in my head. The garden, once a stubborn patch of dust, was now a patchwork of green and gold. Corn leaves shivered in the breeze. Beans curled around sticks we'd cut from the creek bed. Wildflowers had found their way in without asking permission. The air smelled of soil and sage and wood smoke, and somewhere beneath it all the faint sweetness of bread cooling on the table inside. Tayuna walked toward me, a handful of herbs in her hands, their scent following her like a promise. She handed them to me without a word. I tucked them into my pocket, the simple weight of them grounding me in a way money or law never could. The wind lifted her hair across her face, and she brushed it back with a laugh that filled the air like water poured into an empty bowl. "You fixed fence," she said, her English slow but sure. I nodded. "You fixed world," I answered, and meant it. She tilted her head, pretending not to understand, but her eyes, those deep, steady eyes, told me she did. The way she looked at me then, it wasn't gratitude. It was recognition. We had come from different worlds, carried different griefs, but the ground beneath us no longer knew the difference. It knew only the weight of our footsteps, the warmth of our labor, the tenderness in the quiet between us. When the noon heat thickened, we went inside. The cabin was cool in the shade, the air filled with the scent of bread and pine. I poured water into a tin cup and handed it to her. She drank, the line of her throat catching the light. When she set the cup down, I caught her hand, rough and calloused from work, and pressed it against my chest. She didn't pull away. Her thumb brushed the line of my shirt, slow and certain, as if feeling the pulse that had once belonged to a man made only of silence and dust. The ring on her finger glinted faintly, the same tarnished silver band I'd given her, the one that had belonged to my mother. Time had dulled its shine, but not its meaning. Every day she wore it, and every day she made it brighter, not with polish, but with living. Later, we sat on the porch, our chairs tilted back against the wall, watching the long waves of grass shimmer in the sun. A hawk circled high above, lazy and sure. I handed her a slice of bread, and she broke it in two, offering me the larger piece without thinking. That small, thoughtless generosity undid me more than any grand gesture could have. Love, I'd learned, is not the blaze that consumes. It is the steady flame that endures the wind. When the light softened into evening, she rested her head on my shoulder. The world around us began to slow, the shadows lengthened, the birds quieted, the day surrendering itself with grace. The scent of rain drifted in from the west, a cool breath over the heat of the earth. I felt her sigh against me, the kind of sigh that only belongs to people who have stopped waiting for permission to rest. "Silas," she said softly, my name a warm note on her tongue. "Yes, good life," she whispered. I turned to her, took her hand again, and kissed her palm. "Good life," I echoed. And it was. Not the kind of life men write songs about, not filled with wealth or glory, but something far rarer, a peace earned, a love steady enough to carry the weight of two pasts and still walk forward. We had built this life with work and patience, with forgiveness and a quiet, stubborn belief that even in the harshest places, something kind could grow. We spent that evening tending to the small rituals that had become the heartbeat of our days. I mended a saddle strap by lamplight while she folded laundry near the stove. She hummed softly, that same tune I'd first heard her sing while sweeping the floor months ago. It was not a sad song, but it carried the echo of distance, the way memory carries warmth even after the fire is out. When the moon rose, I stepped outside to the yard. The sky was vast, jeweled with stars that shimmered like dust on black silk. The wind moved through the grass in a slow rhythm, whispering secrets I no longer needed to chase. She came to stand beside me, wrapping my old coat around her shoulders, the hem brushing the tops of her bare feet. I put an arm around her, and together we looked at the world we had claimed, not through ownership, but through care. The land stretched out, unbroken, a wide breath of healing. Somewhere out there, Holt was likely still sitting in his empire of paper, drawing lines on maps that meant nothing to the wind or the soil or the hearts that beat upon them. But here, there were no borders, only the slow, honest rhythm of things growing, mending, living. She turned to me and placed her hand over my heart once more. "Still here?" she said, a faint smile curving her lips. "Still here," I whispered back. The fire inside had burned down to embers by the time we went in. I banked it, feeling her eyes on me as she braided her hair by the light. When she finished, she came to where I stood and rested her head against my chest. I felt her heartbeat, steady and calm, and realized it had become the rhythm by which I now measured time. I kissed her forehead, breathing in the scent of sage and smoke and home. Later, when she slept, I sat beside the window and watched the moonlight spill over the floor. Her breathing was slow, peaceful. The scar on my jaw ached the way old scars do before a storm, but the pain was gentle now, folded into the rest of me. The desert outside was quiet, save for the soft rustle of wind through the brush. I thought of everything that had led to this moment, the choices, the losses, the mercy of a single act that had changed everything. I thought of the woman asleep beside me, and how she had taught me to see the world not as a battlefield, but as a garden waiting for faith. When dawn came again, it did not surprise us. It arrived like something we had both been expecting, patient and kind. We woke to the sound of doves and the smell of bread reheating on the stove. She laughed when I burned my fingers trying to pull it from the pan. I laughed too. The sound felt clean, like water moving over stone. We ate at the table with the window open, the air warm and golden. The seeds she had planted months ago had begun to bear small pods, tiny, defiant proofs that hope, once planted, will keep returning, no matter how often the wind tries to tear it away. She pointed to them with a kind of proud disbelief, her eyes shining in the light. "Grow," she said again, the same word she had spoken when we first pressed those seeds into the ground. I reached across the table, touched her hand and said, "Always." Outside, the horizon glowed. The world was wide and full again. We had no map for what came next, only the promise of each new morning and the trust that whatever waited, we would face it together. The land, the light, the love, all of it humming in the same language now. The day stretched before us like an open road, the kind that doesn't ask for anything except your willingness to keep moving. She stood, pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders, and stepped out into the sunlight. I followed, and together we walked down toward the creek, our shadows long and joined. Sometimes, when the breeze is just right, you can still hear the hum of that place, the song of healing, of courage, of two people who refuse to stay broken. It's not a story about saving or being saved. It's a story about choosing each other again and again until the world finally believed in their peace. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that love can still grow in the harshest soil, leave your thoughts below. Tell me what hope means to you. Share your voice in the quiet. And if you'd like to walk with me again through stories of love, loss, and healing, tap that like button, subscribe, and leave a comment. Let your words join ours beneath this wide, forgiving sky.